Zaratherma, after years upon years of single-minded, obsessive labor, finally completed the Panama Canal. Furnished with hundreds of dead and welcomed by the fanfare of wind whistling through the empty treasury, the grand project was finally done, and the business began to come. The deal was simply too good, especially for the export markets of Pengbei and Pengnan. Still, the economy was in shambles, and a financial cushion was desperately needed. The other sectors of the Zarathermite economy were convulsing due to the lack of economic nourishment, and were in dire need of immediate cash infusions to sustain them. Mekhus Mamarsh Caridus imposed a variety of programs, ramming them through the Praidu Atenai. These programs included a new income tax, a licensing program for various guilds, like shipbuilding licenses and piracy permits, a tax on luxury goods like rum, sugar, and tobacco, import tariffs on goods that were also produced locally, such as lumber, beef, and tobacco, and most important of all, immigration incentives meant to attract young professionals from across the civilized world. All of these, down to the last letter of the law, were duly hated, but they made the Preta money. And with the Great Canal and its influence firmly in their hands, there was little they could do to resist these motions of tyranny, at least for now. Zaratherma represented a favorable immigrant destination for various reasons, among them being that the new laws of Zaratherma still represented an improvement of condition for most arrivals, even with the new taxes and licenses, and Zaratherma had a lack of workers, due in part to lower than usual population after a deadly canal project, and the tendency for people not to settle down and have children, preferring instead the free life offered them by the Pirate Guild. These immigrants came in droves, and Zaratherma's population would come to increase from 8 million to a staggering 14 million between the years of 1916 and 1930. The sources of these immigrants were almost entirely from Europe, with significant shares of Romans and Phrygians leaving the oppressive imperial structures which they chafed under for generations. One such immigrant was an unemployed young man from Rome, a deserter of the Imperial Legion named Lucius Evander. Chronically rebellious, he detested the confining command structure which the rotting empire yoked about his neck. One conspicuous day, a farm town in the east was causing trouble, agitating for fairer prices from the Roman legion. Evander was chosen to hand down the news that no fairer prices would come. Indeed, the legion would arrive to simply take the grain, and if they wanted to live, they would have it waiting for them at the mouth of the village's main road. Incensed by this injustice, he gave forewarning to the village instead, and told them to flee with their stock, after which he returned to camp. When the legion arrived the next day, instead of being met with an empty town, they were met with hunting arrows and stones, with the crates of grain burning in the center of town. For this, the legion leveled the place, killing every inhabitant. Though, they did torture the village elder until he gave them information, that being that Evander had given them forewarning of the attack. For this reason, he was given 20 lashes and hung by his wrists in the local prison, waiting to die. The prison was shoddy and rat-infested, with a rusty little barred window. After 3 days of waiting, the poorly constructed mounts for the chains gave way, and he collapsed to the floor, one shoulder dislocated, and one shackle shattering open. After forcing his shoulder back into place, he looped the chain around one rusty bar and pulled, tearing it free with a few large stones as well. He scrambled out from the window, and, hefting his chain over his shoulder, escaped to a port, sneaking onto a vessel headed for Corsica as a stowaway. The Romans had no jurisdiction over Nam Ning's European colony, and it was there that he worked as a hard laborer on a grand plantation estate. The owner of the estate considered himself enlightened, and allowed his laborers access to the estate's private library 2 days out of the week. Here, Lucius taught himself to read Latin, his mother tongue, and eventually came across the canon comprising the discourse surrounding the societal organism. After reading his fill, and saving up enough money, he left the employ of the estate and got onto a ship chartered to Zaratherma in March of 1916. During the voyage, equipped with pencil and paper, he began to write voraciously, pouring his seething hatred out onto the page, forging in a frenzy a book without chapters or any conventional method of organization. a book enigmatically titled The Tyrannical Beast. Evander's conception of the societal organism was aligned with that of Patsiathe, affirming that it is an illogical, wild beast impossible to tame. However, unlike Patsiathe, Evander took the relationship between man and the societal beast in a radically different direction. Evander expounded on the nature of the societal beast as a ravenous, insatiable creature which makes decisions based on its appetites. The appetites of the societal beast take many forms, like the accumulation of wealth, maintenance of hierarchies, and domination over the minds of men. But all these heads of the Hydra lead back to one source, the single aspect in which the appetites of the societal beast are essentially rooted: oppression. The societal beast exists to restrict those that live beneath it. It feeds on oppression and thrives on the most draconic and galling forms of it. That is the common end of the tyrannical beast, the common end of all human societies as they exist today. However, it doesn't have to be this way. In order to liberate oneself, the societal beast must be killed. Its head must be severed clean from its body, and an ivory cup must be hewn from its tusks from which men can drink deep of that intoxicating libation: freedom. Just as a man cannot sleep soundly with a bear in his house, so too can a man never be free so long as the beast and its evil appetites command his every whim. Evander's conception of the world after the death of the societal beast is one which orients itself in such a way which prevents the birth of another one. That is to say, if Clopha conceived of the societal organism coming forth from man's interconnectedness, then the new society must be one comprised of atomized, total individuals, and all interactions between them must be completely voluntary so as to preserve their complete freedom. In this way, Evander sees man return to his natural state. This state of being is then mediated by voluntary local councils where people living in a given area work together to improve their conditions if they so desire, and protect their free society from outside invasion via the use of volunteer militias. Other aspects of the society include the abolishment of money in favor of returning to a system of bartering for goods and services, as well as a peer court system where disputes can be settled so long as both parties agree to a trial. Lucius ends his book with a final addendum: that one cannot kill the societal beast peacefully, and it will not die of old age. It is an inherently revolutionary act, which tears the prior order of the day asunder in every instance. In addition to this, one free society is not safe until every society is free. The world is like a dense jungle, filled with the societal beasts which governs every people in a fashion similar to how Patsiathe described it. Evander states until every last monster in the forest has been killed, mankind cannot lay down to rest. And so he arrived in Zaratherma, finding work at a dockyard building ships, and saving up money to get his work translated and then published, which he eventually did in 1920. The Tyrannical Beast was an extremely cheap book which began to circulate among Zaratherma's underclass, becoming rather popular among the impoverished locals of the islands and among the newly arrived immigrants as well. The philosophy laid out by the Tyrannical Beast would come to be known as Evandrism. Meanwhile, back in Europe, between 1916 and 1920, the map changed even more, with rail networks linking one end of the continent to the other, and factories spanning its length, though the industrial core was still focused in the colonial regions. Back in Asia, one predominant ideology defined the thinking of that age: Daji, or the Great Knowing. Daji was less the work of a single thinker than it was the culmination of centuries of Chinese political and scientific thought. Daji postulated that human ideas exist in competition with one another, like a fish in a lake, and the best among them are the ones which survive and define the character of the lake itself. Daji goes further in saying that just as man can artificially introduce a much stronger fish to the lake, God has introduced the ideas of the Chinese people, which rise above to dominate the rest of the world by their very nature. Daji also says that it is morally good for creatures to obey their nature, so therefore it is the nature of the Chinese peoples to conquer the entire world. This also, ironically, tracked with a noted secularization of the Chinese people, who often preferred to leverage evolution to this same end instead of divine will. Pursuant to this widespread ideology, Shaojin pursued yet another colonial expansion in 1920, subsuming the rest of Denmark and northern Germania. This was too much for the Empire to bear, and they launched a war against the colonizers, which would come to be known as the Great Rejection. Rome, under Imperator Numerius Andenid, made great initial gains, first reclaiming Corsica from Nam Ning, then reconquering most of northern Europe from Shaojin. Faced with these gains, it was not only Shaojin which turned the pressure up, but Nam Ning and even Poyang. Enemies united against a people they viewed as their lessers. Defining battles included the Battle of Agrippina, which featured heavy use of artillery on either side, resulting in a Roman victory due to superior angling calculations, and the Battle of Lugdunum, where an army of Shaojin and combined army of Poyang and Nam Ning launched a simultaneous siege, surrounding the fortress city for 3 years before it fell. As the year turned to 1924, the pressure coming in from all sides caused the rotten core of the empire to fall in on itself. People abandoned their mandatory lifetime positions, the value of the Roman currency plummeted as it was debased, and soldiers deserted in droves, even going so far as to flee the continent altogether. These conditions led to the Bonifilii of Rome declaring their independence from the empire, giving rise in order of their departure to the kingdoms of Carnia, Burgundia, Germania, Britannia, and Phrygia, leaving Rome with little more than the Italian peninsula. But even this wouldn't last long. On the 4th of February 1925, Imperator Numerius Andenid, the last Imperator of Rome, was killed by one of his generals, Carcuna Umidus, who was subsequently made Rex of the Kingdom of Italia, in exchange for handing over the city of Rome itself to the Chinese colonizers. They called it Guoji-Chang, or the International City, carving it up into districts and extracting the wealth of generations like the yolk of an egg. This was the diabolical zenith of Chinese power. The Guoji-Chang represented a place of draconic regulation for the native people, but nigh lawlessness for those who ruled over them. The truest crystallization of the dichotomy between Chinese and European. For example, the Poyang quarter was characterized by its various games, flowing with fine liquor and clandestine human fights to the death. The Shaojin quarter was starkly different, characterized by its austere regimentation of the locals, pressing them into grand building projects like the Cathedral of St. Mark, while the occupiers busied themselves with scholarly debate and flights of artistic fancy. The Nam Ning quarter was perhaps the most debauched of them all, and was famed for its many forbidden fruits, featuring drug dens and brothels as far as the eye could see, as ships scuttled in and out of its harbor bringing opiates and people. Ultimately, this city of injustice served as an outlet for all the vices and lusts which were indeed illegal in their countries of origin, the fruit of their secularization just now coming to bear in such a whirlwind of human evil, far and away from their fathers, their wives, and their sons. This would persist until the 1st of June 1930, when the final Oriental injustice was laid upon the people's necks. That night, one of the essentially enslaved fighters of the Poyang quarter refused to strike the killing blow on his fellow man. The crowd demanded he crack his skull open on the hard stone so the bettors could make their money. The minder entered the ring with his vile lash, though before he could strike the poor man, this nameless fighter seized him by the wrists and wrestled him to the ground, slamming him into the stone and spilling his brains upon it. A dead silence fell over the crowd as the fighters awaiting their turn stood up. The crowd began to shuffle as one of them drew near, and panicked when he seized a man at random and strangled the life from him. The denizens of the club fled, and soon the naked fighters emerged from a building set ablaze, and set upon the Guoji-Chang. The entire city descended into chaos, and the news soon reached the rest of Europe through telegraph lines. The colonizers aligned once more, sending a 3-nation army to pacify the rioters. What they did not expect, however, was the defiance of their puppet, Rex Carcuna Umidus of Italia. After his treachery, he was afforded the rights of a Chinese man, and indeed spent much time in the international city, though this would prove to have been a mistake on the part of the Chinese powers. As he sated his various appetites, he peeled back the layers of the city and began to see darker and more grotesque parts of it, becoming disgusted with it and with himself. He suffered a failed suicide attempt in 1927, which left him with a permanent limp. Since that incident, he set his mind to right his horrible wrong as soon as the opportunity presented itself, gathering ships and growing his armies, which he told the Chinese were intended for an invasion of Sirdia. Now, his vast fleet came to challenge the ships of the three nations at the Battle of the Tyrrhenian Sea. While the three nations' ships boasted far greater firepower, they were prohibitively expensive, and so therefore were relatively few in number. About 5 major ships per battle group, so 15 overall. Meanwhile, the vessels of Italia were built for speed, sacrificing the hull strength and overall size for powerful mounted turrets and a powerful engine which allowed them to tear through the waves, one of which had Rex Umidus himself aboard. This fleet boasted over 50 ships. The battle itself was fraught and bloody, with the Italians sinking 11 of the Chinese vessels, but they still won the day, Rex Umidus dying in the fight. Still, a mere 4 ships and the men upon them were not nearly enough to retake the city, and they settled for simply shelling the waterfront, reducing literal millennia of priceless history to rubble. As they sent word for reinforcements, they received back word that they would not be coming. The nations of Europe, inspired by the resistance of the international city, had set upon their colonizers, triggering the Second War of Rejection. On the one side was Italia, Burgundia, Germania, Carnia, Phrygia, Triballia, Avarignia, Avarignia, Perugia, Samogitia, Britannia, and Norland. And on the other side was Shaojin, Poyang, and Namning. Even for all their might, this conflict was not a fair fight. After all these years of direct contact with Chinese technologies, Europe had finally caught up with them, and now brought to bear the might of an entire continent against them. The international city was immediately subsumed into the Kingdom of Italia, handed over by its internal liberators, while the Battle of Piedmont, characterized by a combined arms assault on the city from sea and land, saw Namning evicted from Europe. Meanwhile, as this raged, business for Zarathurma was booming, and indeed putting a great deal of pressure on local industry, to the point where it simply snapped. A new tax on the sale of stolen goods was levied in order to fund waterfront villas fully equipped with electric lights and plumbing meant for visiting businessmen. A tax on goods earned through piracy was widely considered sacrilege, and the Pirate Guild declared war on the Praedu Atenae and Mekhus Mamarsh Caritas. Mekhus Mamarsh attempted to stem the tide with his personal army, but the Pirates Guild was always larger than the standing forces fielded by the Preta. Indeed, it was the Pirates Guild which did about half the fighting in any given war. It wasn't long before Mamarsh Caritas was forced into hiding, and the government was dissolved. Zarathurma and its guilds were then reorganized into a series of voluntary councils according to evangelist principles. No government, no law, no oppression. Simply the purest principle of this nation's freedom, the open sea. This began a period of history known as the Great Reaving. The Panama Canal was closed for business and instead used as a navigational edge against the nations. Thousands of pirate fleets and military-grade vessels set upon the world, unbounded by treaty or convention. They struck hard and fast at the Chinese colonies surrounding them, as they were so tied up in the War of the Second Rejection that they were almost entirely unable to defend themselves. They also struck Africa and even parts of Asia. Global trade was mortally wounded, and while export-dependent economies withered, import-dependent economies starved, and a global economic crisis caused nearly all markets to contract. The Great Reaving was the full potential of Zarathurmite power, finally realized in all its terrible glory. The world had not appreciated that Zarathurma wasn't actually a pirate republic. It was a merchant republic that practiced small-scale piracy. Now, Zarathurma simply referred to the lawless islands of the pirates, where everything is permitted and all men are their own master. With the backdrop of the Great Reaving, the War of the Second Rejection continued to rage on, with Avarignia and Triballia forcing Poyang out of Europe by 1932. characterized by heavy urban warfare requiring innovative new ordnances, like flashbang grenades and even primitive flamethrowers. Though, it was soon after this that Rex Sethra Indicitus de Roma began to negotiate with Xiaojin for the sale of some land along the border with Tribalia, seeking to personally enrich himself, holding no confidence that the Europeans could really keep the Chinese at bay. His plans were found out by his wife, Arya, who alerted the public by various means, writing to newspapers and sending telegraphs to military officers. Rex Sethra discovered her plot and murdered her in a rage, slashing her throat with a letter opener. She was a well-loved public figure, so her death was seen as an outrage. However, when coupled with his plans for personal enrichment through treason, it was grounds for civil war. The Avarignian Civil War broke out on July 13, 1932, and took Avarignia out of the War of the Second Rejection. It was also at this time that South Avarignia invaded, hoping to place the Indiciti Deostum line upon the throne. As such, the sides of the Avarignian Civil War were the royal faction under Rex Sethra Indicitus de Roma, situated in the northwest of the country, the military faction under General Vicario Lucchini, situated in the southeast, and personally inspired by the writings of Paziate, whom Vicario harbored as a chief advisor, and finally the invading faction under Rex Orphae Indicitus Deostum, situated in the Kingdom of South Avarignia. This conflict would be defined by slow, grinding battles, and trenches tearing deep into the earth. Meanwhile, by 1934, Xiaojin was the final Chinese colonizer to be thrown out of Europe, their final stand at the Battle of Friesland Bay putting the final nail in their coffin, and putting an end to the War of the Second Rejection. Still, no official treaty was signed. It was just that the colonizers sulked back east and were unable to make further treks west due to the Great Reaving. It would be more properly referred to as a ceasefire. In all, the War of the Second Rejection cost 45 million lives, making it the deadliest war in human history. Phrygia soon invaded Europe, hoping to fill a potential power vacuum left by their ancient rival, and horrified at what kind of example this would set for their own component nationalities. Serdia was the one most affected by the invasion, and as such, Mongolistan invaded Phrygia in turn. Indeed, this was motivated by fear and shallow greed, and in any case was poorly thought out. The loss of international shipping had dealt a lethal blow to Phrygia's economy, and the near-worthless Suez Canal now only proved a burden in terms of upkeep. Given how much they had come to lean on it, the entire supply chain fell to pieces, and millions began to starve in the Great Famine of 1935. This, coupled with an expensive and unnecessary war of expansion, led to Phrygia falling to pieces, reduced to the eastern Mediterranean, while a myriad of petty military despotates arose from its ashes, the Suez Canal being lost to the Despotate of Palestine, and the ancient power of Crete gaining independence and returning to the world stage after over a millennia of subjugation at the hands of the Phrygians. Meanwhile, in Asia, society as a whole was shell-shocked by their defeat in the West. Not only were they beaten, but they were shoved off the peak of their power into their lowest point yet. This embarrassment, coupled with the global economic contraction, led to the social fabric beginning to break down, and widespread riots across the East, most notably resulting in the independence of Urufenkai. This period would come to be known as the Jusong, meaning depression. It was said to be a kind of civilizational ego death, and drove the growing secularization of the East. Then, on January 14th, 1936, the Avarignian Civil War ended, with South Avarignia rebuffed, and Rex Sethra Indicitus de Roma put on trial for his crimes and executed by hanging in front of a crowd of thousands. General Vicario Lucchini then announced the formation of a Pazzi military government over Avarignia, and gave the stage to Renatsu Paziate to mark the end of the kingdom with a speech. Today we stand beneath the auspices of fate. Let it be known that the fat within the halls of power has finally been trimmed, tossed into the fire with a bubbling crackle. But it is not enough. What lay ahead is the refashioning of an entire nation, the resurrection of the national spirit of an entire people. the apotheosis of our societal beast. We are Avarignians, of the very oldest stock in Europe, and that beating heart in your chest carries the blood of men who have killed and killed again, soaked to the bone with blood, so that you may become what you are destined to be. No longer will weak aristocrats stare down their noses at you. No longer will foreign filth pollute our sacred earth. No longer will the horrors of the international city be repeated. No longer will you be a footnote in history. The future is ours. The only thing keeping you from it is your fear. Lose your fear and become something glorious. Unrecognizable. Beastly.